Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Roma Greer. Hi Kat, thank you so much for joining me today. We've finally been able to connect after a long time.
Finally, Jules, I'm so excited.
It's great to have you here. Kat, let's start off by you telling me a little bit about your micro galleries.
Yeah, Micro Galleries is a free, socially conscious global arts initiative that roams around the world virtually and in the physical space and tries to use artists as a harnessed global community of amazing minds to create positive change in places and spaces that we think need it the most. We do this through three distinct ways. One is through virtual programs. We run a lot of art programs calling out to communities we wouldn't be able to access otherwise, like the far reaches of Nepal or Samoa. And we showcase the creative outcomes through our social media platforms on Facebook and Instagram, for example. We have International Arts Collective of over 45 artists from around the world, from Kenya to Finland, to Indonesia, to Nepal, to Sydney. And we utilize that global community of artists throughout the year to create new artworks, to address social, environmental, and political problems in their community and the broader community, and to bring artists that wouldn't normally meet together so they can hopefully create new opportunities and networks for themselves. And then the third way we do this is through our flagship program, which is the Micro Galleries Live Festival, which is how we began, actually. And we go into a community that we think is in some kind of need, and we work collaboratively together with them on and off over a period of about 9 months to reclaim some of their public space and create open-air galleries. And over a 2-week, what is basically a street art festival, we bring art straight into these communities where they don't normally have access to art. And accompanied with that is a program of tours so that the local community can be introduced into all of the artworks that have been placed up there, talks, workshops, symposiums, live music, live performance, digital art. And we try to make the art as accessible to the community as possible because they're quite often communities that don't have any access to art or creative expression themselves.
Wow, that is so impressive. That's amazing. I'm so impressed. Now, do you normally have to travel to these areas to facilitate this? And I guess during COVID, you're not being able to do that, or do you do it all kind of digitally and online?
We have a combination of both. Usually we have a digital component. So I think of it a bit as expanding and contracting between being on-site and live with artists from all over the world and locally being on-site creating a festival in much more of a physical traditional sense. Like we're all there putting up artworks and creating and talking and connecting. But then we spend most of our year on the virtual space. WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, Zoom, all of the usual virtual platforms. And of course, because of COVID, all of our festivals and physical activities have had to be cancelled and put on hold. We were actually meant to be in Manila doing a program a few months ago, which obviously got cancelled. And that had been 9 months of lead-in time of traveling back and forth to Manila, working with the local community, connecting with the local people and the local teams there, and collaborating and building a creative response that was relevant to that community. So it's super disappointing that didn't happen. But because we've also always functioned in the virtual space, it was really exciting to also pivot into what we'd already been doing quite a bit over the past few years. Because obviously we can't travel all over the world to reach everybody in a developing country. So having these social media platforms now to be able to engage with them has been incredible for us anyway over the years. And so we're really focusing on that at the moment.
Is that why it's called micro galleries? Because you're on so many different platforms and in different spaces and in different areas?
No, but it might be now. That's an excellent explanation.
Yeah.
Going to 100%
yeah. That makes sense, doesn't it?
It will now that it's going to go direct on my website. No, the original reason was that when I first moved to Hong Kong, I actually found the physical space so overwhelming, but also the traditional arts industry here so big and overwhelming. The massive art fairs, everything was big. And I'd been aware of this movement called the slow art movement, where you would go to a gallery or a museum or go and look at public art, but you'd just pick 2 or 3 pieces that you wanted to see, and you would just spend time with those pieces and reflecting on those pieces instead of everyone's done this run through the Louvre, a million miles an hour for the day and absorb nothing of quality. Just spending some actual time with these pieces. And I realized that potentially what could be really interesting in Hong Kong is to take all of these artworks from around the world of artists, make them accessible by putting them up in lanes for people to just sort of happen upon, that you didn't have to walk into one of these beautiful, pristine, white-walled galleries, and that you would actually engage with them. And if I made them quite small, people grew very curious and leaned into them and actually tried to engage with them and spend time with them. The reason initially it was called micro galleries is because we literally did all the artworks reasonably small against this massive urban scape of Hong Kong. But as the program has sort of organically evolved completely into something else, we've kept the name and we can reinterpret it in so many ways now, as you've just so eloquently done.
Thanks so much. That's cool. Kat, your bio states that you're a curator, urban distributor, and creator of public art interventions that focus on positive social change. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What is the sort of positive social change you're looking for?
Basically, I believe that everybody has the right to access and engage in art and creative expression. Growing up, I grew up in this really low socioeconomic regional Australian town where there just was no exposure to or access to the arts, really. And I feel like if someone had just brought art into my life and put it on my doorstep in some way, that my life would have been much more enriching and fulfilling at the time. And having gone on through some unreasonable brain process of mine to actually pursue arts, despite the odds, I found that it gave me an incredible power to perceive the world in really interesting and different ways and perspectives, to be able to critique things, unpack things, to express myself in certain ways that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And I often look back to that experience growing up and feel it's very unfortunate for young people growing up to not have access to art, for people working 7 days a week, 18 hours a day at the wet market in the middle of Denpasar to not have access to any kind of art or creative expression. I really wanted to take that experience that was the cornerstone, I guess, of my life of growing up without access to this and bring it to other people. And since I started doing that, I saw how much it had a powerful impact on people's lives. People who didn't have any information about really important local political, social, and environmental issues now had a way into understanding those issues that wasn't threatening or overwhelming in terms of theory or data, but had been translated and reconfigured in really interesting, accessible ways through art for these people to be able to understand and engage with. And also people just reclaiming their own public spaces. And instead of just having government announcements and developers in their space, they can take their public spaces and transform them into a much more fun, colorful, vibrant environment for them that they can enjoy being within, which is hugely important, again, particularly in low socioeconomic communities. And so I really, over the years, witnessed how much art had an impact through these means. And I wanted to create more platforms and opportunities for artists to bring that to communities and for communities to experience that.
That's so cool. And I think that having that creativity can really feed the soul and can really enhance people's lives, can't it? So there's something very positive about bringing art into the communities.
Absolutely. And I think this time that we're experiencing now, where a lot of our lives have been made much smaller and more restricted, we're relying on arts in a million ways that none of us ever even considered that we would rely on them, from Netflix to a book to an amazing podcast. Everything around us is informed by arts in some ways. And I feel like just because those of us who've had the privilege of education or position within society or accidental exposure to the arts because we live on Hollywood Road and that's amazing, I don't think that that should be kept for just the few within society, that we should be sharing that and empowering people through arts.
Is the work that you're doing not just in painting and drawing, but it's in crafts and digital media and all sorts of areas within the art world?
Absolutely. Definition of arts is that it's any form of creative expression. So it's much more of a contemporary perspective on arts. Traditionally, people put arts and mediums into very rigid categories. So you're a painter or a ballet dancer or a playwright. And what I really like doing is fusing all of those ideas. So a ballet dancer collaborating and creating in a laneway with a graffiti artist, or a movement artist hairdressing in the streets, so cross industry ideas, or having artwork bleed out of really formal spaces like galleries and theatres and auditoriums, and having it move out into laneways and public squares and balconies and shopfront windows and warehouses, places that people feel less scared to enter into, less intimidated by. It's very intimidating to walk into an art gallery or a big exhibition and feel like you have to have knowledge and understanding and look a certain way. And I don't think that's what art is actually meant to be, just this transaction. I think it's meant to be something to be really embodied and experienced in our everyday lives. I think contemporary art forms enable that to happen. Projection art out on the street, we've been seeing a lot of that around the world as a form of protest, for example, giving people a voice in a way that isn't necessarily damaging anything or being violent. I think it's a really exciting series of new ways of creating that make art more accessible, but also make it more highly distributable to people as well.
That's so cool, because back in, like, when I was a kid, art was seen as high art. It was seen as something for the upper classes. It was seen as something that was quite inaccessible, and that you had to have this sort of historical knowledge and this understanding of different techniques and different eras of art and all that kind of thing, where you just don't need that now. And what you've been talking about with the blending of all of the industries and the ideas and the styles, it makes it so much more contemporary and accessible to anybody, which is really great, isn't it? And you're actually reminding me of the Adelaide Festival Fringe. Did you ever go to the Adelaide Fringe?
I've been at Edinburgh Fringe, but not Adelaide. It's on the list for sure. Yeah, same idea.
Amazing. So a lot of what you're talking about is really evident in the Adelaide Fringe.
I think Fringe really festivals, that's actually a really perfect example of what I'm talking about, where there's not only like traditional art forms, but done in slightly different ways, but the ability to experiment and explore with arts in a kind of semi-risk-free environment. That's what creates new ideas and new ways of seeing things and new narratives and new ways that our community can function or our institutions can function, because you're able to experiment with everything without the rigidity of this kind of idea of high art. And I think really importantly, high art forms, they're so important and they're wonderful and they're amazing. But I think it's important we think of them as being part of a full ecology of what we have creatively in our society. If we just have high art forms, which is very much the focus, especially at times like this when arts funding gets cut everywhere, if we just have these high art forms, we don't have the fertilization of creativity happening all along the way that eventually produces an amazing opera singer or ballet dancer or painter. But also high art forms are incredibly inaccessible. I was researching a couple of years ago about Opera Australia, for example, who are phenomenal. They get the lion's share of arts funding in Australia. But if you are on social welfare payments in Australia, I think you're looking at having about, say, $350 a week, and an opera ticket is $250. It's completely impossible to think that you could buy a ticket and go there on that kind of financial income. I think these other art forms are raw, they're gritty, they're cheaper, they're more accessible, they're in unusual spaces, doing unusual things, and they're very exciting for people who can't access things like opera.
That's such a good point. And I think that's what we want to really happen more in society. And that's why what you're doing is brilliant, is just allowing it to be more a part of the fabric of our culture, rather than something that you have to be able to have a certain amount of money or a certain amount of knowledge to access. That's really cool.
I think it's a beautiful way to put it, fabric of our culture. It's interwoven into our daily experience.
You can use that too. Pop that on your website.
I'm going to. Everyone check the website out for quotes by Jules.
I love it. You said that you grew up without much access to art. So when did your interest in art sort of develop, and how did it develop?
I think it was just mostly by accident. I read a lot at the local public library, and so gained some kind of exposure to literature and the arts through books, and then just sort of pursued it and landed in being trained as being a singer. Someone picked up on I could hold a tune. I think people were just grasping at straws then for anybody who could do anything seemingly above average slightly. I was identified as a singer, and so I started to do singing lessons, and then through that started to become aware of theatre and a local gallery, but it was still just impossible to access. So even if my parents knew that there was a theatre show on, they wouldn't have known how to, I mean, this is pre-internet, right? They wouldn't have known how to buy a theatre ticket. They probably couldn't have afforded it. They probably couldn't have afforded the bus fare there and back. It was super working class in the middle of a recession. I think I was just lucky, to be honest, that someone heard me sing and sort of picked me up via that. And through that, I got into university to do theatre performance and classical singing, which was an amazing experience.
I'm so jealous. Go on.
I don't think we realized how amazing it was at the time to just turn up every day and create and learn and immerse ourselves in art and be surrounded by phenomenal, like-minded thinking people. It's just the dream when you think back to it. But I guess that probably wasn't how I ended up where I ended up now, though. It was just sort of a milestone on the path, because that was mostly a traditional training process. And I got out of university and started auditioning and doing everything everybody does, begging people to come to your shows. And I just found the whole thing, to be quite honest, very vain and unfulfilling and inward looking, and not really having any kind of creative impact that I wanted it to have. And I sort of ended up working for this alternate fringe arts organization called PACT in Sydney. And they were working with multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary artists who were putting their work out in the community, and Indigenous artists who were doing the most phenomenal stuff that we were helping to elevate. And it was so exciting and amazing to be part of something so much more meaningful, that I think that's probably really where my arts journey began from that point on.
How did you end up coming to Hong Kong?
My partner got a job here. I feel like, does everybody have the same answer?
I would if I had a partner, but no, I had to get myself here.
Oh my gosh, I wish my answer was, as a strong feminist, I brought myself to Hong Kong, but sadly, no.
I came here on my own with my 11-year-old child with 2 suitcases and 2 boxes.
Oh, see, I want your answer. Let's do this again.
That's all right. I want your uni degree.
Okay, we're clean swapping this. Yeah, so unfortunately, yes, the age-old female story. I came here with my partner, but actually what I thought initially I was taking a huge hit in my career, and it ended up being the absolute making of my career, because Hong Kong and Asia in general is just extraordinary place of exciting opportunity. And when I was first here, street art and public art was very constrained and very much about government-approved works or developer-commissioned works. And there was very little else that was happening. And since I've been here about 10 years now, so over these past 10 years, it's just absolutely shifted and blossomed. And with a lot of protests that have happened over the years, that's been a huge instigator for some phenomenal art as well. So it's been amazing to be here over this period and watch it emerge, but also to be, hopefully, I like to think, being part of that evolution here as well.
We've talked about your interest in art and how that grew, but then how did your interest in social change, how did that grow? And were they aligned, or did they come at separate times?
I think they were really aligned. I just remember being in an audition, and it was ridiculous. I think I didn't get the part because I didn't have blonde hair or something. And it just made me feel like everything I'd worked towards and loved turned out to be quite facile. And I'd actually been thinking about being a social worker when I had to make a decision about what I was going to do at university. And I started to reconsider my decisions at that point and the direction I was going to take things. And when I moved to Hong Kong, I really noticed the huge discrepancy in people's lived experience, from the hedge fund managers down to the women wheeling cardboard through the streets on trolleys. Obviously, that's present in a lot of societies, But probably that combined with the lack of access to free public community art, I think that was the moment these two things fused together, that there was a gap here in Sydney where I'd been trained and been practicing. There's a huge culture and a lot of government support and financial support from the government to bring art out into the communities. And I was really shocked to not see that here in Hong Kong at the time. So I just really wanted to be part of that. And seeing the discrepancies here in Hong Kong, that felt like the place I wanted to start, that really fused my two interests.
Well, that's super cool. I'm so impressed with that. And that makes a lot of sense. They're kind of really well connected, aren't they? Social justice and creativity. They're very sort of interconnected. I think if you've got that sort of passion for one, you can easily have the passion for the other, which is very cool.
I think artists are quite often extremely motivated by social and environmental and political causes. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that it certainly feeds their artwork and their own forms of expression in really meaningful ways.
Did you make a conscious decision to meld the two of them together, art and social change, in the work that you're doing in Hong Kong, or did that just evolve naturally?
I kind of explain it as I feel like my whole career was slightly accidental, like a bit of an accidental artistic director, accidental curator and urban disruptor, accidentally in charge of visual artists when I trained as a performance artist. Yeah, it feels like everything, you said it very nicely, it sort of organically evolved. Where the response was positive and there was a need, we kind of kept evolving in that direction. For example, microgalleries began as this tiny one-off, as mentioned before, trying to get people to get out of the galleries and come and enjoy the beautiful urban scape that is surrounding them, these amazing lanes in Wan Chai and Tin Hau, and come and look at some artwork there that's fused with the local streetscape, which is art almost unto itself. It kind of started with that, and putting content in of artists around the world who were exploring big social, political, or environmental issues, and bringing that into Hong Kong, where I felt perhaps sometimes the awareness of some of those things wasn't as much as I'd experienced in other places. I sort of started as that. And then I just kept getting asked to remount it and do it here and do it there. And can you explore it doing this? And the whole thing just snowballed completely and insanely out of control into this Goliath of a situation with artists from all over the world and programs running constantly and amazing festivals in Kathmandu and townships in Langa, South Africa. And obviously we were meant to be in Manila, so spending a lot of time in the Philippines. So it's brought me to these phenomenal places and we just keep getting asked to do more. It just shows there's a need and it's working. There are many programs like microgalleries out there using art for phenomenally, amazingly, excitingly moral and ethical purposes. And I think there's a reason that there's more and more of them and they're growing. It's because we need it right now.
What are contemporary creation practices? What does that mean? And how can they specifically influence positive change? Like you've kind of alluded to it in some of the examples that you gave earlier, but can you be a bit more specific or give me some examples?
Sure. We talked a little bit before about the rigidity of the different creative practices and roles. It was actually a really huge thing in the development of art around the 70s when those barriers and rigid categories started to really be broken down properly. I particularly like thinking about it as working in multidisciplinary, so many different art forms creating together, or interdisciplinary, which is two or more art forms creating, but they're completely inseparable. For example, if you have somebody singing and there's a painter painting behind you on stage, that's actually multidisciplinary. It's a couple of different practices occurring simultaneously and complementary, but interdisciplinary, which I think is where we really start to get into contemporary creation practices, is where the art forms cannot be separated. If you can remove the singer and the painter still painting could stand alone as something happening, that's not interdisciplinary. So it's really about bringing art forms and intertwining them for new outcomes that potentially haven't been seen before or are able to explore topics that haven't been explored before using this.
And some key examples of positive change that maybe you've seen. I'm sure things like raising the profile of domestic violence or something like that could be an example, or giving women a greater voice than they have in some communities, things like that. I mean, what specifically have you experienced?
I think a really good example of this is our Global Day of Creative Action regarding climate disruption was the focus in September last year. Obviously, climate disruption is a huge environmental, social, and political issue that we're certainly seeing come to the fore now. And I've been doing a lot of research on how artists can intersect with this issue and bring about some positive change. We had several outcomes based on that research, and one of them was this Global Day of Creative Action, where we called out to artists from all over the world to come together in their communities with other artists or themselves and put up some form of creative expression in a public space using any art form that they wanted to use. It could be stand up on a box and do a poetry reading, project artwork onto a wall, run a workshop, do an installation. And the core idea for this came from, I'm sure many of your listeners have seen, usually when there's a big meeting about climate change or some kind of UN meeting that's occurring, artists go out the front and do a massive artwork, often commissioned by a group like Greenpeace. And they're huge and they're incredibly impressive and they get a lot of traction online. And I really noticed that the messages that we were hearing from these meetings, all of the summits that were occurring, they weren't getting as much traction globally and online and in popular culture than the images of these artworks were getting. They were circulating all over the world and hugely powerful. And quite often they were utilizing contemporary performance art. So things like performance artists would build tanks all throughout the concourse and immerse themselves in water and function in suits as if they're in their everyday lives, but they're actually performing live on the side in performance response to what was happening with rising sea levels, for example. The problem with this is many people who are going to be affected the most by climate disruption, they're not getting access to the information coming from these summits, and they're not getting access to a lot of the artwork that's emerging. So we wanted to take this idea of these incredibly effective artworks, but put it into their local communities where it was more relevant. The idea was that the Global Day of Creative Action asked artists to come out in the communities and create a public response to this on a smaller scale to what you'd been seeing, obviously, at things like the summits and G8s and so on. We had 100 artworks emerge all over the world from, I think it was 27 different countries, Fiji, Nepal. It was completely overwhelming how successful it was, actually. And what we saw across those hundreds of artworks was a range of different creation practices. So, for example, in Papua New Guinea, they really drew on traditional performance and a grieving process. They almost held a funeral where they all utilized this image of a turtle and had face paint on and immersed themselves in water, and there was music and words being said. So that probably wouldn't be considered traditional art practice. Whereas when you loosen up the boundaries of what constitutes art and what doesn't, people have more access to create however they feel confident and however is relevant to them in their community. And by doing that, first of all, it's public, it's much more accessible, it's usually free, and it's relevant to the local community, and it's not intimidating in any way. People don't feel like they need to have had an arts degree under their belt to comment on an artwork or look at it and think that their opinion is valid. They know their opinion is valid. They can relate to it, they understand it, and they can engage with it.
And then it's impactful. So the message comes across and they get a lot more than they would from a poster or a TV ad or something like that. And it's also often more interactive. They're there, they're a part of the art, which is really nice as well. So I can see how it could really, really be such a great platform or a great way to promote positive social change or environmental change. It sounds amazing. Have you ever been in Green Queen Media? Have you been featured there?
I think actually I was speaking to someone from there before COVID hit.
Yeah, you need to get on there. I need to connect you with Sonali. She's amazing. She's been on my podcast.
There are some phenomenal things emerging out of Hong Kong over the past few years.
Yeah, you should meet her. She's amazing. And you should be featured in Green Queen Media Asia. That is so amazing. I'm so impressed. And I think, do you do any outreach in schools or anything like that? Are you connected with schools at all? Because what you're doing is incredible. And it'd be amazing if we could get that into education programs. I don't know if you know, but I'm a teacher in an international school.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm thinking about it, because what you're doing would be incredible for art students or global perspective students, or many sort of different subjects could get involved in what you're doing.
I think this has really been on my mind recently, and I think we're absolutely on the same page about this, because I often think about the projects that we run and the places that we go. We can't stay there. We don't have the resources and the people. So we often have to just inject what we can and do what we can and then leave. And I think that what currently many programs like microgalleries and others are lacking is the capacity to make a sustained impact in these places. And I truly believe the key to that is the education system wherever we go. And we try to connect with the local schools wherever we work, and we offer free workshops for them without international artists and local artists and make connections. But the hugest obstacle for developing this idea is a complete lack of resources. We had one really phenomenally powerful experience in Kathmandu. There was a school that catered to the local low socioeconomic village that had sort of developed nearby, and the children would come and be there, for 8 hours. And the school was a charity. It wasn't getting government support. They were really dependent on the generosity financially and in terms of knowledge from the kindness of strangers. And they were doing an incredible job. And we really made a beautiful connection with them and wanted to help them create an arts program that we funded for the next year. So it wasn't just one workshop with us for a day, but it was potentially for a year. Just getting the funding for it in this climate is virtually impossible. So if any of your listeners have a great idea, connect me, because
absolutely.
There must be a wonderful way to combine education and getting these ideas into schools.
And there's got to be so many corporations in Hong Kong that have so much money that are looking to fund projects which promote diversity, inclusion, positive change and things like that. It's got to be out there. So anyone listening, Kat's details will be in the show notes. So connect with her and make this happen. What about in Hong Kong? Are you doing any work with students in Hong Kong? And also, are you doing any specific projects in Hong Kong with minority groups or lower socioeconomic groups?
We've done a couple of projects about 6 years ago in Hong Kong. We did two, one in Wan Chai and one in Tin Hau. And that was really about trying to capture the essence and celebrate some of these older laneway communities before they'd been gentrified, which was what's happening everywhere. But it was really happening quite quickly about 5-6 years ago in these two spaces. And so we did a couple of projects in spaces like that in our early days of our evolution. Since then, we kind of really have focused on developing communities. And a lot of other groups started to emerge in Hong Kong, like phenomenal projects like HK Walls and Secret Walls, and people doing stuff on the streets that was really exciting and was getting a lot of traction. And we kind of like stepped back from the space and looked at places where there really was nothing happening. Part of our model is that we only ever go to places once. A concept that I'm really conscious of is the idea of cultural colonization. So kind of being an outsider with these sort of relative knowledge and resources and taking over the space of a community. And I think that that's hugely problematic. I think what's much more empowering is to go in there and reinvigorate and knowledge share and then hand over the possibility to a local organization. So wherever we go, we always work with a local partner group, an arts organization or a community-based group, and they act as our co-collaborators for the entire project. And then we sort of hope that what we've shared with them and the connections they've made with us will help them continue on doing something similar in their own locally relevant way. We haven't returned at this point to do anything in Hong Kong, but I feel like situations here are changing in such a significant way. It could be time to look again here in Hong Kong and start to address some new issues that have emerged.
Yeah, you could do something with refugees in Hong Kong or street sleepers or people in caged homes. But I think also it would be really amazing to try and get students involved in things like that as well, because we've got such talent. We've got incredibly talented students who would really lend themselves even to the programs outside of Hong Kong. We run this thing called Horizons Week, where our students once a year, it's not happening this year because of COVID, where they go out and for a week they get involved in a project outside in different communities, and service is a big focus. And we also want it to be ongoing so that we're actually putting into the community and it's not just tokenistic. And we're going back every year to really build on what we've created and creating a relationship within the community. It'd be amazing to see if we could do something there and link up and maybe even get students involved in the projects in some way like that.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
I have done some speaking at several schools around Hong Kong, and I'm always constantly astounded at how informed and excited to embrace change and be the change makers themselves these kids are. I mean, I was 16 hanging around down the local park, trying to make plans with my mates for the weekend.
Yeah, designing your tattoos.
Yeah, right. And these guys, they're coming up with their own social initiatives and social ideas.
And have a really strong understanding of the sustainable development goals as well, which is brilliant.
Absolutely. Which I think is, you have to tip your hat to some of the teachers in Hong Kong, and that it's very much on the agenda to empower these kids into doing this. which I just think is extraordinary. Our teachers were really just nagging us to read Lord of the Flies. It's a whole new world. And I truly believe that the young and emerging creatives and change makers of our society are probably what's going to save us all, I think.
Absolutely. Let's hope so. That's what I keep
Gosh,
telling them.
I hope so.
I keep saying it's your job. Focus.
Please. I remember hearing someone say, you just got to get the world to the next generation and we might be okay. And I feel very much like that right now.
Yeah, I think, and there's some incredible potential in those young people that we're teaching. So it's really quite exciting. We just have to get a sustainable planet that's safe, that they can grow old in.
Absolutely.
So congratulations on being named one of Australia's 100 Women of Influence for Culture. What did this accolade mean for you? That's incredible. How did that happen?
It's a little bit shocking. I think the fact that the award even exists is just amazing. At first I was a bit like, what? And then I have to admit, it was really empowering to be connected to 99 other women in Australia they were just doing the most extraordinary things, like jumping out of airplanes in the middle of Afghanistan to administer emergency medical help. And these women we need our young women and those who identify as women throughout the world to hear what women are doing everywhere. They are incredible. To be honest, personally, in the moment, just being exposed to all of that was hugely motivating and inspiring. Obviously then, because I'm a woman, I had to question what on earth I was doing while these women are jumping out of planes in Afghanistan and I'm sticking art on walls with glue. So there was a slight crisis.
Much more than that. No, come on.
Oh, gosh, I hope so. I've dedicated so much time.
Yeah, but Brené Brown talks about comparative suffering, and I'm sure she would talk about comparative success as well. And we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to others. We should look at our own successes and be proud of what we're achieving. Yeah, we are.
Different ways to all of it. And being put alongside those women was a huge boost to my motivation and direction. And realistically, it was incredibly important in how I was perceived in many places that you wouldn't even think it would matter. It's actually really hard to engage with communities who don't know you. They're very distrusting, and rightfully so. There's a huge culture of white people rocking into communities going, hey, we're here to help you. Let us do our idea and we can change your life. To be able to say to these guys, do you know what? Look, I've got a tick from these people. They think I'm okay. Do you want to let me in? Let's have a chat. Let's see what we can do together. It was incredibly helpful, to be honest. That's been the biggest benefit for me personally. But also just getting a tick from a group of women who you can look up to is incredibly exciting. And I think we need to do that for more women all over the world.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so impressed. And do you feel that this award has helped you reach a wider audience and helped you connect in more ways than before the award? Or is it just kind of separate and a great accolade and something that you're really proud of?
It's something I'm really proud of, certainly. And I think that it helps anybody who potentially wants to assist us in what we're doing understand that I've been assessed and audited and checked by people who know what they're talking about, and they can put some level of trust in me. And it's very hard to turn up to places like, I go into UNESCO or an embassy and I'm like, hey, you don't really know me, but could you give me some money because I'm going to do this massive project, in the middle of a slum. And understandably, they're very skeptical. So being able to come with some validation is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I completely get that. I understand that. I have the same kind of experience with my book and my podcast, having won some awards and being recognised or nominated. It gives you more of a platform, and it does give you more sort of validation for what you're doing, and it gives you a little bit more kudos when you're trying to put other things out there. So I get it.
I think
it's really
it gives you that platform. That is exactly perfectly said. Yeah, it solidifies this platform and says, yeah, this is real. Trust this person. They're going to do this.
That's brilliant. Tell me a bit about the Arctic Circle residency that you completed. What is that? It sounds fascinating.
Oh my gosh, sign up for it. It is phenomenal. So
did you go to the Arctic Circle?
Yes.
What?
Yeah, for weeks. It was. Look,
were you cold?
I was so cold.
Yeah.
I mean, come on, we're Australians. We're not meant to be there. But it was definitely a life-changing experience on so many levels. It was really phenomenal to get the opportunity. I applied not thinking I would. The basis of my application was to do research in how artists and arts can affect change in people's understanding and motivation to do something about climate disruption. I was supported by the Australian Council for the Arts to go as well, because it's not a cheap endeavour. So without that kind of arts funding support, I wouldn't have been able to go. What that meant is I got to spend a lot of time in the UK talking to other organisations and people and artists who were doing incredibly interesting things in this space. And based on all that knowledge, I then sailed through the Arctic for nearly 3 weeks with 28 other artists, educators, innovators, change makers, scientists, activists on a very small, it's probably a massive boat. It's not very small to me, but because you're in this surreal environment on a boat together, the knowledge sharing and the ideas that emerge, and you're talking to people from different industries and practices. So you're learning so much so rapidly. But probably, I think most importantly about that experience was I honestly thought I was going to one of the last pristine spaces on Earth where I knew what was happening. I'd read a lot, I'd researched a lot, but oh my gosh, we have no idea what's happening. We are so unprepared. We don't know the extent of this even slightly. I was standing on a rock and there was nothing between me and the final piece of land before you hit all of the ice. And there was a tiny piece of blue plastic. I mean, how did it get there? It was just extraordinary. We would do these landings on glaciers and take plastic bags and pick up rubbish while we were there and get rid of it. And then we'd be standing on the boat and a glacier would carve in front of your very eyes. Now, glaciers do carve or crumble, as part of their movement. But this wasn't just one carving of a glacier, which everyone raced out to capture on the camera. You then realize, oh, this was going to happen for the next 18 hours of us being there continuously, just ice falling, melting, crumbling. And whatever happens in the Arctic is like a litmus test for what's about to happen in the rest of the world, because these are the coolers of the Earth. And if they're melting and we're heating this up to the point where there's huge repercussions happening there, we are going to feel that all over the Earth. And it's going to get faster and it's going to become more and more dramatic. For me, it was hugely powerful because the people who are going to be first and worst affected by this are the very communities I've been working in for the past 7 years. And they have no idea what's going on. Their governments are not necessarily communicating it. And even if they are, it's so data heavy and intangible and complex that it's being dismissed or they just can't comprehend it. And a lot of people in these communities are very much in survival mode. It's live day by day. Get your kids somehow educated, somehow get a job, somehow eat. So trying to bring the idea of climate disruption into their world is really difficult. A lot of my research showed it was essential that we do that these communities who are going to be worst hit deserve a voice in the global conversation about this issue. And I really believe art is an extraordinary way to educate and inform and translate information, but also then to empower these communities to be able to talk about what's happening to them and to be able to disseminate what's happening to them to the rest of the world.
That makes complete sense. That's so interesting. So would you say that climate change is your main sort of social change platform that you focus on, or do you have other areas of interest as well?
It's my personal passion right now, definitely, and I can't see it going away. It's been years now that I've really immersed myself in this issue, and I believe it is a focus. However, as we are experiencing now, there are so many things going on that I've really been reflecting on. Perhaps it's time to think in a more broader sense that it's not simply climate disruption that's the problem. This is a huge issue about our systems and institutions and societal values as a whole. And if we don't change all of those, we aren't going to have a sustainable environment. We aren't going to have people who feel like their lives matter. We aren't going to have women who are empowered and experience equality. So I think that there are many issues at play right now that all come back to the same problem. And I think climate disruption is one outcome of systems and values and infrastructure and institutions that no longer work.
It's interesting that you're calling it climate disruption rather than climate change. Can you explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah.
Why that terminology?
It's a little bit controversial, I think, but I'm standing by it because the theory is that when words have a lot of power, obviously, you have a podcast, you know this certainly, right? And so when you say climate change, it makes it sound like this is just another natural change in the history of the climate of our Earth. And it's not. This is definitely not just a change. And there was a lot of discussion amongst scientists over about 20 years about, is this really something that's being done by humans? Or because there's a lot of weather patterns that occur daily and there's a lot of climate patterns that occur over long periods of time. And they've certainly come to the conclusion now that this is definitely a man-made, person-made issue, that it is a disruption to the natural progression of the climate and the evolution of the earth. It is not simply a gentle change. And I think it's important that we bring that home.
Thank you for explaining that. That makes great sense. And I will now change the language that I use.
You could be at the next party, like, listen up, everybody.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
disruption.
That's amazing.
But a lot of government bodies don't like me using that word, especially if they're funding us. It's too controversial for them. They want to stick with climate change. So, yeah, it's a contested term slightly.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So that's really cool. I've learned something new. That's really
good. Great.
Yeah, thanks. Do you think that the world can change via the medium of artistic expression?
Yes, I definitely.
Yeah, you wouldn't be doing it otherwise, would you?
You just couldn't.
You've got to be hopeful.
You ain't in it for the money, right?
Yeah.
This is my lifestyle, my true bedrock of values and beliefs, that I think many things can change the world. I don't think arts is the only tool to do that. But I truly, passionately believe that all of us have an obligation to the next generation to use whatever skills and talents and interests that we have to make some change, however small, in our world in a positive way. And I think you're very much doing that through the way you speak to so many people and give them a platform and lift their voices up and give them exposure to people who wouldn't have heard from them. So I think using your skills and talents to do that, however that is, whether that's arts or going into schools and speaking to kids.
Yeah, I'd love you to come and speak to our kids. That'd be amazing. Let's do that once we're over this COVID thing and we're actually back in school. So that would be amazing.
I would truly love to do that. I have a really great story if we have time. Great. Thanks. I love telling this because to me, this is the most condensed version of why I do it and why I believe arts really can make some really wonderful change. However small, I think it eventually leads to bigger change. So I tell this story a lot, and it's about a kid called Robbie that I met in Denpasar. Bali has a huge amount of street kids, and there's actually a lot of drought in Bali due to climate disruption and a range of other issues. A lot of the kids sort of migrate to the city looking for work and food and shelter. And we were doing an installation in the lanes near the market there in Denpasar. And Robbie sort of came up to us with his hand outstretched, looking for money. He was begging. And we don't give money to children because it encourages them to stay out of school, right? Instead, we said, oh, do you want to help us out for an hour or two and we'll buy you lunch? And he was really excited by hanging out with us. And this kind of moment, he just sort of started mixing glue for us and unfurling paper and handing us stuff. And all of a sudden, he started to take this responsibility of hanging out with us really seriously. And we were there for 10 days and he would turn up every day and he would direct traffic so that we weren't hit while we were installing works. He'd direct us to the good food. He'd ask the artists if they want help. And then you sort of started to see these other things happen, like the international artists were starting to teach him more English, and which I'm not saying everyone should know English, but it's really great for Balinese street kids to be able to learn another language and expand their horizons and possibilities that way. And then he'd help out an artist and they'd disappear over to the market and come back and he'd have a new t-shirt and he'd start to look a bit more smart and started to take himself really seriously. He started asking a lot of questions about the art. Then we came in early one day and found he'd got in there like an hour earlier than us and picked up a bucket of glue and had been fixing up the artworks before we'd even arrived. So we're already on site for the first tour of the artworks. And then, so we run these tours of the artworks with local people to give them a way into the artwork and say, hey, we want to tell you about this so you can really get into it and enjoy it. And we turn around one day and there's Robbie doing his own tour of the artworks with the local street kids. I know it's mind-blowing.
Oh my God, that's
really
amazing.
Was phenomenal. And then the last excellent moment was right before we left. He'd taken a real interest in photography and he'd gone up to one of our artists who had this phenomenally expensive camera and asked if they could teach him how to take some of his own photos. So he was actually now creating his own artwork and leading groups in his community. This little street kid who started off with this dirty face and handout all of a sudden had transformed into a kid seemingly really excited about doing this stuff and wanting to create himself and take pictures of what he was witnessing happen around him. And so over the years, we've been trying on and off to kind of get him into school, which is really difficult in Indonesia for kids like this, and help his family out and help his community out. And it's proving incredibly difficult. But I feel like groups potentially with more resources could then pick up the baton and take that to the whole next level. So I feel like there's a really tiny, small example of how it impacted one little kid's life, hopefully in a really interesting and better way. And that as we evolve, all of us as organizations working this stuff out, we can take that to the next level and help kids like him become leaders in their community and have sustainable careers.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? It'd be great to hear what happens to him as an adult, whether he goes down this kind of artistic route or the tour guide route, or if he can, if he's been that inspired by this experience. But isn't that amazing to have that kind of connection with somebody where you are impacting them on an educational and social and emotional level? You're not just giving him money or lollies or things like that.
Which is what the transaction was from his perspective hopefully going to be. And it evolves into something so much more meaningful. And we could never have connected with that kid without the art platform. We would never have had access to him and his friends and his interests and been able to engage him in such an interesting way. So, I think this is such a small example, and we have a million of those kind of examples up our sleeves. I truly do believe art is a fantastic tool for making change. And I believe artists are amazing Imagineers, and they have the capacity to see a future and test that out in their artwork in new ways and help everybody else see new ways of moving forward, creating blueprints for new possibilities. That I think we're so bogged down in these old systems and ways of thinking, it's hard to sometimes remember that we can innovate a new way of being. And I think artists are just exceptional at that.
I absolutely agree. That's so beautiful. Oh my God, I feel almost emotional listening to that.
I know, wonderful. I always tell this story of Robbie and I want to cry a little bit. Which is ridiculous, but I do love it.
It's brilliant. So, Kat, what are your hopes for the future?
Well, I hope that I have the capacity to be able to sustain something like micro galleries and be able to continue doing these small injections of creativity and positivity into spaces that certainly need it. And I think times like this, when there's political upheaval and there's economic upheaval, the very first thing people sort of dismiss are the arts, unfortunately. And I think ridiculously, times like this is when we really need it the most. My hope for the future is that we begin to change the way we perceive artists and arts within our community, and that I can play a really positive role in doing that. And my sincere hope is that as a global society, we really, truly start to invest in the idea of everybody having the right to creative expression, whether that is the consumption of it or the execution of it. Art is not just a recording of our history and lived experience, but it's a way to imagine a better future. And I truly hope that we manage to inject more funds and more possibilities for artists to help make that happen.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. I'm actually just writing this down as a title for the podcast. Imagine a better future through art.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? I keep trying to catch little bits.
It's great. Sometimes I say stuff and then I read it back and I'm like, did I say that? Like I'm keeping that.
Yeah, that's perfect. Great. I love that for the titles. Kat, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I really want to invite you into school to speak to our senior students. I think that would be incredible.
I would be honoured.
Let's organise that. And thank you so much for coming on my podcast. It's been so fascinating and such a wonderful interviewer, and you've been a brilliant guest. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. And thank you for a great podcast. I have so much fun listening to all the amazing people in Hong Kong and what they're doing. And you're bringing everybody a lot closer. And especially right now, we need that. So in return, thank you.
Oh, thank you. So for my listeners out there, if you've loved this podcast and you're passionate about art and climate disruption, can you please share this podcast with your friends and family? And if you could go to iTunes and rate and review me, then that would be so appreciated, because that will help get Hong Kong Confidential up the charts. But also it will help people learn more about micro galleries and the work that Kat's doing out in the global community. And now, if my listeners, if you want to hear Kat's answers to 4 secret questions, which you don't know anything about, Kat, then you can go to Patreon/Hong Kong Confidential. And for as little as $1 a month, you can hear the answer to Kat's 4 secret questions, and also to the secret questions of my last 30 or 40 guests. We're going to say goodbye here, Kat, now on Hong Kong Confidential, and we're going to meet over in Patreon, and you're going to answer 4 secret questions for my patrons.
I can't wait.
The people who kindly sponsor my podcast.
I'll make them super spicy, guys. Pay your $1. Come on.
Pay your $1 and get on over. Okay, so thanks a lot, and I'll hopefully see you at my school soon. See ya.
I certainly will. Thanks, Jules. Bye.
Hi Confidants, I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.